civilians. Indeed, the new director, David Petraeus, formally resigned his army commission to make that point. The CIA is not a military organization and is not under the control of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What he's saying here is blunt. It is the CIA is not a military organization. It's not part of the military. It's distinct. If they are saying that the CIA is part of the military, using that same reason, we could say that the police is the military and that firefighters are the military. No, the CIA is not the military. Let's move on to the second topic how you argue. You see that this is a U.S. policy, and that is our policy to do this. My response is that the torture is not. The torture is not. Basically saying that we are letting our CIA agents do this. But when you look to the actual tortures performed by foreign countries, as their own evidence said, that he's transported to his own country to be tortured. That is not in the United States. That is outside of the United States. Tivani said that this is illegal in the United States. To my third topic, I have two responses. Number one is that of no evidence. He did not present evidence giving specific law, which even says that this is illegal in the United States. Which leads to my second response, that we need to see the law. Not only does he have to say a law, but we need to see the direct wording of the law so we know just exactly what the exact wording of the law is to see that if it really even does apply to torture. So for now, all three topicality arguments win. That's about the justifications. He said that it's hard to specify which nations. I have two responses. Number one is that it's no evidence. He did not present evidence saying, again, well, this is kind of reinstating my point, is that they did not present evidence showing nations that have followed in our lead because of the United States. This is my second response, that you can specify. You can specify. Take the instance of giving military to Colombia. When you look to the false positive scandals, which is the Colombian military killing innocent civilians and changing their clothes and burying them and saying they were terrorists, they say they're doing this to justify the aid from the U.S. You can't specify whether a nation is doing something because of the U.S. or not. So I ask you not to look at the argument that it's just hard to specify because they're not saying it, because you can't specify using the example of Colombia. Let's move on. He said under my fourth response is that the plan is to remove, this is under the solvency plan, the plan is to remove and that the U.S. is directly causing this. Our response is that, again, the U.S. is directly causing what's happening in Colombia. They killed innocent civilians in order to justify, because the U.S. put a condition on the military. They say you have to kill this many terrorists and then you can have our aid. Therefore, they're killing innocent civilians, saying they're terrorists, just so they can continue getting the aid from America. They're doing this in the name. The U.S. is directly causing this. Let's move on. He said that no numbers exist out there. I have two responses. Number one is this is exactly our point. We do not have numbers showing how many of people are innocent. We only have 1 to 2 examples from the affirmative team. The second you can title as LCS, which is initials LCS. Now basically this is a case actually being run at NITOC to stop using LCS ships, which are literal combat ships. The Navy is saying that they're great and they're perfect. But when you actually look into reports and studies done by naval analysts, you find out that you can't find numbers showing that this is actually a completely defective ship that the Navy is supporting. Therefore, on the outside, there might be no numbers. When you really look into it, you can find numbers, but we've seen no numbers by the affirmative team. Let's move on to the international law significance point. He said international law is good. My two responses. Number one is that some is good. As the example I said in cross-examination, there's a bill in the United Nations. Therefore, if we were going to make ourselves subject to international law, we will have to follow the laws made by the United Nations, which is completely unconstitutional, which is my second argument, that international law is unconstitutional because of Article 161, so the affirmative did not respond to all legislative powers in Congress alone, not the United States. It is for that reason that I strongly urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
So we're affirmative prep time?
Thank you.
Thank you. 30 seconds used. Minute used. Minute and 30 seconds used. Minutes used. Two and a half minutes used. Three and a half minutes used.
All right, can we start that time? All right, then I'll begin. Let me start at the very top of the flow with topicality, a couple different responses. Now, his first topicality argument was that of the military, and they said in the last speech that it's not a foreign military commitment because the CIA is not the military. Two responses. The first one is out of evidence that we've actually presented in the last speech from an actual policy maker saying that indeed extraordinary rendition is a military policy. So regardless of any of the rhetoric, we do have specific evidence from a policymaker saying what type of policy it is. My second response is that while the CIA is not a part of the body of the military, it carries out military policies, such as the negative say the Department of State carries out some of these policies. They're not the military either. CIA does help to carry out some of those policies though, and this is one of them. The second point that they made was that it's not foreign. Two responses. First of all, again, the 1AC evidence that we read at the very beginning of the speech that talked about how we do send people out for torture in other countries. My second response is that torture is illegal domestically. I don't have evidence stating it, but no, we're not allowed to torture in the United States. It's blatantly illegal. We're allowed to interrogate, but not to torture. That's why we have to send these people out to other countries. They can't be tortured in the United States. Now let's move down to the arguments concerning the the national sovereignty issues with the international laws, etc. 5 responses. My first one is out of non-unique. The United States actually follows most international law right now, so our case doesn't necessarily change that. My second response is that it is in our interest. In our interest. Yes, I don't believe that we should necessarily be held to everything that other states want to place on us. I believe we should act in our own interest. Stopping the practice of inhumane torture that gives us no information, that's actually in our national interest. My second response is that torture is wrong. In fact, our own laws say that torture is wrong, which is why it's illegal. So this is a good international law that we should follow, because we follow it domestically. My fourth response is that they didn't contest whether or not the international law was good or not. They simply said that international generally is bad, but they didn't contest this one. My fifth response, therefore, is that we're not forced to comply. Not forced to comply. In fact, right now, we're not complying, but we believe that actually it would be very beneficial, it would support human rights for us to comply. We believe that is a good thing and a decision that we should make. Let's move down to the arguments then about whether or not other countries have cut off cooperation with us and the actions of the other countries and numbers. Now, first of all, that they said we can specify how many countries have cut off cooperation because we've had different aid programs. One response is that of undermined credibility. Now, we don't have numbers saying how many people cut off cooperation because what happens is they don't necessarily cut off treaties with us because of it. They simply lose trust in us, and that's not something that you can measure. The fact that we tell other countries to stop torturing, yet we're perpetuating that problem, it's clearly something that would cause other countries, based on our evidence, to lose trust in us, not necessarily full treaties. Secondly, it said that we talked about Colombia and how we're condoning what's happening in Colombia, we're not acting on that, and that's bad. First of all, I would have to agree that Colombia, the situation there is bad. It just is. Our policy is not perfect. There are millions of different things we could do this year to reform our policy to benefit other countries. However, secondly, our plan solves for United States torture. Now, the human rights abuses in Colombia obviously are bad. What the United States right now is doing is directly sending people overseas to be inhumanely tortured with suffocation, electrocution, the other things that we mentioned in our very first speech that undermine the entire idea of human rights. And we solve for that by making sure that the United States is no longer involved in any sort of torture. Now let's move down to the fact that we don't have any numbers for how many innocent people were actually harmed. Now, even if there was only one instance, we believe that that is a reason to change policy. But secondly, it's susceptible to flaw. Basically, there's no way to actually check back against it. Third, I'd like to point out they talked about how it's not necessarily all faulty evidence that we get. Maybe some of it is good. However, this is actually from PBS News, April 2013. They said, quote, "No military commander would ever go into combat based on this evidence from extraordinary rendition because they know that they can't verify it," said Tyler Drumheller, the former head of covert operations in Europe, unquote. What he's actually saying is that no military officer would actually trust information based on torture because it can be unreliable. The fact is we know cases where it's actually been wrong, such as the search for Bin Laden and the Iraq War, and also is unreliable. For these reasons, we would ask you to end this policy. Thank you very much.
Okay. Starting negative prep time. 1 minute and 40 seconds remaining.
Ready?
Yes.
Timer?
Yes.
Are you referring to?
Yeah.
All right, so let's get started right off with the argument you said that basically one human rights abuse is enough for the United States to end extraordinary rendition. I have 2 responses. First, No, it's not. That means they are not significant in this debate round, and if they are not significant, they lose the stock issue, which means that we win the debate round. My second response is that this is a double standard. My partner asked them in cross-examination, well, if there was one human rights abuse in North Korea, would you, he asked them, since there are human rights abuses in North Korea, would you attack North Korea? What did they say? They said, no, we're not going to attack North Korea. But wait a moment, there are human rights abuses in North Korea, why not attack them? Isn't one enough? This is a double standard being held by the affirmative team. If one is enough, then in that case we should invade Colombia, we should invade Bahrain, we should invade North Korea. If we hold to this standard presented by the affirmative team, then every single conflict will happen in the world, because every single nation at some point commits a human rights abuse. It's just unstoppable, which means that every single nation would be at war with each other. This is an extremely flawed ideology by the affirmative team. Now let's move into their other points. First off, my standard I brought up that of evidence specific to the nations, and basically they came back and responded by saying, well, we're undermining our credibility. My one and only response is, where? They brought up a piece of evidence saying we're undermining our credibility, but it never specified any nation anywhere saying we are not respecting the United States anymore. They just said, oh yeah, we're losing our credibility. But where? Which nation? They have to have specifics. They have to have a nation saying, we're not going to reform our human rights abuses because, hey, look at you. You have to have human rights abuses yourself. No examples anywhere. No credibility lost until they can provide specifics to nations. Now let's move into the other point. The disadvantage. She had 5 responses. First, she said it was not unique. My response is that this is, again, a flawed ideology. Just because our national sovereignty is violated in other areas doesn't mean we should just go ahead and violate it once again. If you see a baby on the train tracks, you don't say, oh, there are probably hundreds of babies on train tracks all over the world. No, you say, that baby's going to die, I'm going to save it. If we are here going to again violate our national sovereignty, then we don't say, oh, we violate our national sovereignty other places, so we should just violate it right here. That is an extremely flawed ideology of the affirmative team. Her second response was that it's not in our interest. My response is, well, I'm going to be talking about later on when I'm talking about the false info, showing how it is in our interest of the United States. Her third response was that torture is wrong by our own laws. My response is that of no evidence. No evidence. She herself stated that she never provided any evidence, that they didn't have evidence that said it was illegal in our own nation. Her fourth response was that it was never said the law was bad. My response is, yes, we did. Well, to the evidence I presented that this laws for international recognition of human rights is in fact a very bad policy for the United States to tie ourselves to. We did in fact provide specific evidence to this case. Her fifth response was that I'm not forced to comply. My response is, exactly. You don't have to comply with this international law. You don't have to. If you do, then we will lose our national sovereignty. That's the point of my disadvantage. Right now, we're not forced to comply with it. But once we do comply with this law, then our national sovereignty is violated. That was the point of my disadvantage. This point was really nothing to do with my DA. Let's move into the false info. Now, I brought up basically my argument that if there was no numbers, no statistics, nothing backed up by the affirmative team. Her only response to this was basically that military leaders would not use. Okay? My response to this is, where's the statistics? Look, military leaders don't always not use it. Just because some military leaders, because one guy says, oh, no military leader in the entire United States is ever going to use this, that's totally false. Of course military leaders are going to use information they find. That is totally wrong. In fact, their own arguments disprove this point. That's my second response. That of a contradiction. If they said that military leaders are not going to use information that we have found from torture, well, we used information we found from torture to go into Iraq. So their own arguments disprove this point. They themselves said military leaders would never use it, but they themselves said military leaders did use it, which means this point is disproved by their own premises. Let's take a look into their point, basically under Colombia. My partner said they cannot solve for this. And she responded by saying, oh, well, we still will solve for our credibility being undermined. My basic one and only response here is, you can't solve for our credibility if our credibility is being lost in other places. So, now let's get into my voting issues. Voting issue number 1 said national sovereignty is violated. National sovereignty is violated. Now, until my colleagues actually provide you evidence contradicting my disadvantage, it does not stand. Now, the disadvantage to national sovereignty does stand, however, because according to my own evidence, by complying with these laws of international recognition of human rights, then we do tie our national sovereignty. The point stands. Voting issue number 2 is that of no numbers. I'd like to point out that my partner's point of our point in LCS was dropped by the last team. And my third, well, I'm out of time, but basically, vote of no negative.
30 seconds remaining for affirmative prep.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Alright, it's 5 minutes by the way. I can't do a lot, that's because I accidentally put it to 6. Anyways, alright, if you're ready, hit the timer. And the negative? Alright. Quote, the human rights violations associated with CIA's secret detention and extraordinary rendition operations were significant and systemic, but the United States has still not repudiated the unlawful practice of extraordinary rendition. This is a quote from Amber Singh, Senior Legal Officer of the Open Society Justice Initiative earlier this year, basically saying exactly the point of the affirmative team, that this is an inhumane, unlawful, and ineffective practice, but the United States has not gotten rid of it. When you take a step back from all the numbers and everything, and the arguments on the specifics and the significance points, what we're really debating today is should the United States keep the policy of rendition or not? Do we get any benefit from it? And we're going to take a look at that in this speech. Before we go any further, though, I would like to point out the negative team did not pull through again the issue of topicality, so there isn't an issue of topicality with our case, just to clear that up. So let's go through the negative team's different voting issues here. Their first voting issue was under the argument of national sovereignty under this disadvantage. Now, essentially, my partner made the argument that it's non-unique because we already follow international law, many different international laws right now, so if international law really undermines our national sovereignty, it's already doing so. And they came back and said, well, this is flawed because that doesn't mean that we should always follow international law. The point my partner was making was that torture is bad. Laws against torture are good. It's not like if there was a UN international law against murder, for instance, it wouldn't be bad to follow that. It wouldn't undermine our national sovereignty because it's not making choices for us. Torture is a bad thing. We just should be following that law. Torture is wrong. And even if they're right and this does undermine our international sovereignty, there's not really any impact to this. The negative team didn't read specific evidence that ending extraordinary rendition in order to follow international law would mean the end of freedom or something. That doesn't make any sense. Additionally, even if you do accept this disadvantage, all it does is take out the justification of illegal. There are still two other justifications of inhumane and ineffective. So even if you accept their argument here, there is still very large reasons to vote for the affirmative team's plan. Let's go to his next argument here, which was, my partner said that they just read general evidence for this, but he said they read specific evidence. I'm not sure that's entirely true. He didn't read specific evidence saying extraordinary rendition and repealing it would do X. I'm not entirely sure that's actually true. He didn't read evidence of that. His final argument here was that, well, we don't have to comply. We should basically just do whatever America wants and not care about the rest of the world and what they want. Now, the fact is, as my partner said, it is in our national interest to stop torture. Torture is a bad thing. The United States perpetuating torture is a bad thing. That is something that is in our national interest to stop. Now let's move down to the argument of basically the Colombia argument here. And basically, they talk about how we had a double standard. He said that, basically he was pointing back to the cross-examination where I said we wouldn't invade North Korea right now even though they have human rights abuses. I'm not advocating invading anybody. That's not what our plan is. There's a difference between invading a country over human rights abuses and the United States stopping committing human rights abuses. This is not relevant whatsoever. Now let's move down to the Colombia issue. On the Colombia issue. Well, basically he said here that, well, where are we specifically undermining cooperation? Now, let's take a step back here from the specifics and ask, does this make sense? Yes. When the United States tries to condemn the human rights abuses of countries like Egypt and Syria, they can turn right back to us and say, you just asked us to torture someone. How can you tell us that our human rights abuses are bad? We've supported that with evidence, and if you think about it, it makes complete sense. The United States can't tell countries to stop abusing human rights when we are telling them to abuse human rights for us because we can't do it ourselves. That doesn't make any sense. We don't have a specific piece of evidence that says Egypt won't do X because the United States has extraordinary rendition, but this basically just makes sense. It's completely logical. When the United States tries to stop human rights abuses, we can't do that if we're perpetuating those very abuses that we are trying to end. Now let's move down to the argument of whether the information is effective or not. Now, the negative team made an interesting argument here about the contradiction. We said that no commander would ever go into battle based on this evidence, and he said, well, we went to the Iraq War. I'm honestly not sure how this supports the negative team. The Iraq War claims were false. So we went into battle there And regardless of the other effects there, the information there about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction, that information was false. So it was proven to be false. And then our piece of evidence was from several years later, saying that no military commander would ever go into battle based on evidence from extraordinary rendition. So maybe he updated his policy on that after the Iraq War. What we found was that in the Iraq War, extraordinary rendition evidence was completely unreliable. This was from the former head of covert operations in Europe. This wasn't some random military private. It was the former head of covert operations in Europe saying that evidence from extraordinary rendition is unreliable. Additionally, we read evidence in the 1AC from a PhD in social psychology that evidence obtained from torture simply cannot be held to be true. That's essentially what we're saying in today's debate. So is torture inhumane? Yes. Is it legal? Yes. Is it ineffective? Yes. So we ask you to vote for the Affirm Team's plan and abolishing this policy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for judging. And thank you, Pena.
You bet.
Thank you very much, sir.
You bet.
Thank you for judging, sir.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
Nice hearing you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Absolutely.